Let's look at part 3 of this series, DBCC shrink file. So we've looked at how to do it. We've looked at some initial best practices. But here's some of the things that we can do to stay on top of this. Always remember that there is a huge cost associated with an interruption. And the reason why I bring up the interruption here is that oftentimes when we're dealing with DBCC shrink file, we are dealing with situations that create interruptions. So you're in the middle of building something and all of a sudden you get interrupted because you're out of space or you have low space or etc. And the result is that you have to stop what you're doing, you have to go solve the problem, and then you have to come back to the problem, let's say hypothetically. Okay. Well, the problem is that in about 6 months, the cost of that are thousands of dollars, because as many of us know, when we get interrupted and then we have to come back to what we're doing, we often have to follow that train of thought. Even if we take really good notes, even if we have good video documentation as well, it's amazing how many times we still have to come back and go through the whole logical process because it's like, well, wait, why wasn't I doing this, etc. So one of the ways to avoid that in a situation like this is to prevent this from ever happening in the first place, to prevent these disruptions. So number one, keep data and log files on separate drives. Okay, that is one of the best practices. It's one of the ways to reduce this DBCC shrink file. Number two, build a low space alert that automates the solution. The least creative thing, and I'm going to skip to the D here, is the alerting, right? It's the least creative of all. Now, the bottom line, it's just going to alert. It starts to get annoying. And it still requires manual intervention. Instead, look at automatically adding more space to the drive. That is very possible to do. Also, look at automatically scaling out to another drive. Also possible to do. In fact, I think B you can do in TSQL. And then C, automatically shrink files under certain conditions only. This one is you have to be very careful with. You can do this with logs, but make sure, though, that it's under those certain conditions. You don't want to be trying to shrink a log when there's transactions hitting that log, okay? And you want to be careful about that, okay? Number three, honestly look at what is being done when there's an issue to avoid the overreaction, okay? Which is part of the reason why we end up having disruptions is, okay, what are these solutions to the problem? I'll give you a great example. This is I think about 3 or 4 years ago. There was an environment where this applied, where they were shrinking files. And I said, okay, so I'm confused. What do we do when we shrink files? Well, we have to add space to the driver. We shrink the file. That was the only two options. So how do we know when we add space to a drive? Okay, well, it's these environments we have to add space. And in these other environments, we have to shrink. Okay? Do you realize that what the person just said is an algorithm that could be automatically solved? Who has time to do all of this in 500 servers, right? My point is okay, so when we take an honest look at what are the honest things that we have to do in this situation, to the root issue is we either have to expand the drive or we have to shrink the file. Let's automate both of those. There's no reason to be manually doing that. It's a lot of work. And really in large environments where, it's like, well, we'll have to expand the drive. Well, then maybe we ought to look at, when you talk about saving time, expanding the drive as large as it needs to be in the case of, let's say, data files or maybe even log files, to where we already have it there before we ever get into that situation. Again, we want to avoid that cost of interruption. When I hear people say, well, that's going to cost us, an extra $500 or $1,000, how much do you think interruptions cost you? I guarantee you it's a lot more than that, okay? And then 4, for logs, ensure best practices like frequent log backups, batching, frequent checkpoints. For data files, consider how you expect your environment to grow and how to automate the solutions when you do grow it out that way. Whether that is, okay, well, we're going to have to attach another drive. Okay, how are we going to do that on the, let's say it's a VM layer, or how are we going to do that on the virtual machine layer? How are we going to automate all of that, right? And so when you get into that position, and the other thing too as well is consider the fact that if you are above a threshold, one useful alert, which is not an alert to say, oh my gosh, I need more space, but you could alert on when it's time to scale. When it's like, okay, we're above that 70% threshold. Sure, we have another year, but it's time to start thinking about how we're going to scale this environment, how we're going to move databases, migrate things. So on that D point, even though I do think that alerting generally is the least creative of all, if your alerting is a scaled alerting, like you're alerting on we need to start looking at moving, re-architecting this design, that actually can be very useful because there are many situations where it does come down to, okay, we're going to have to look at how we're going to scale out this server.